Welcome to Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Join us as we continue the story of Jubal Stone, U.S. Marshal, Blood Trail to Hell, by Casey Nash.
Chapter 7. Dry Gulched at Silver Creek. Jubal and Red left Hillsborough at a lope. It seemed both horse and rider liked the open country. Of course, anything was better than staring at four steel walls and trying to be comfortable in a noisy rail car wobbling down the tracks. A couple of times, Jubal nudged Red with his spurs and gave the horse his head. The roan did not disappoint. He was faster than a jackrabbit through sagebush as they moved swiftly across the plains. Up ahead, Stone spotted what looked like sand. As he got closer, it was what he had hoped for, a watering hole. There was a small wooden sign nailed to a cottonwood next to the edge of the bank that read Silver Creek. Of course, some of the letters were hard to read from all the bullet holes. It looked more like a sieve than a sign. Jubal pulled his pistol and added his mark. Red crow-hopped but quickly settled down. But the next round that Stone fired, the roan didn't even flinch. "Old Hank was right about you," said Jubal as he patted the gelding's neck. "You're not afraid of gunfire, are you, boy?" "Well, if it isn't a man who talks to his horse," came a voice from the woodline. Jubal pulled his gun and quickly found a short, big-bellied fellow with a thick black mustache. Red sensed something behind him and nickered. Before Jubal could respond, two other men stepped out of cover from the other side of the creek with rifles raised. In broken English, they threatened Stone. "Throw down that pistol, amigo, or we'll blow you out of that saddle." Jubal pitched his pistol into the sand. "Now step down slowly and you may live," said the pudgy fellow who first addressed him. "What do you want?" Stone asked gruffly. "Well, to start with, let's you and me do some hoss trading." He pointed to an opening in the brush. There stood a gaunt, long-necked sorrel filly with her head hanging low. The fat man stepped forward and attempted to jerk the reins from Jubal's hand, but it proved harder than what he had imagined. Irate, he turned to his friends. "If he does that again, shoot him," he snarled. "Now give me them reins." When he tugged this time, Jubal pulled the fellow toward him and spun him around. Then they both turned toward the fellows across the creek. With his arms tightly around the bushwhacker's neck, he snatched the man's pistol from his holster and stuck it to his temple. "Drop them rifles, or your friend's done for." The two Mexicans laughed and slowly stepped backwards into cover until they disappeared. A few seconds later, Stone heard the sound of thundering hoofbeats. "Sounds like your partner's left you high and dry, amigo." With his trigger finger gently against the trigger, Jubal pushed the hammer forward with his thumb. Then he shoved the heavy-set man forward and stuffed the confiscated pistol into his belt. Reaching down, he picked up his Colt, twirled it 3 times on his finger, and set it down into leather. "What's your name, mister?" Jubal asked the man. "Juan." "Well, Juan, I'm taking your gun, but leaving you your horse. It's a mite more I figure than you'd have left me." Juan put out his hands wide to his side and with a large smile said, "Oh, senor, no, we were only playing a game with you." Stone wasn't buying it. "You best find another line of work, friend, and some new partners. Now get." At that time, Jubal had no way of knowing, but he had just been introduced to the Silver Creek Banditos at gunpoint. They had robbed and stolen guns, horses, and other possessions from dozens of cowboys, settlers, and other unfortunates who'd stopped for water over the last 3 months. The trio weren't killers, but troublesome, pesky thieves plying their trade. Jubal would cross paths with them again in the town of Glen Rose. Stone kept his pistol trained on the fellow until he saw him ride away. With the pistol still in his grip, he led Red down to the water and let him drink his fill as he topped off his canteen, all the while on the prod for hostiles. Stone was learning the hard way that staying alive on the Texas frontier was not going to be easy. After the Roans finished drinking, he stepped aboard Jubal. Stone, tightening up the gelding cinch and boarded. You and me, Red, are going to have to keep our eyes peeled if I'm to stay alive, and you don't want to be owned by the likes of them. Chapter 8. The Thorns of Glen Rose. A few days later, Jubal and the roan reached Glen Rose. As he rode up Main Street, Mr. Henry Bartley, the owner of the biggest mercantile in town, greeted the new lawman and pushed the sage broom across the boardwalk. Well, hello, Sheriff Stone. It's mighty good to see you. We've been expecting you. I'm Henry Bartley. Jubal stopped next to the boardwalk. And you, Mr. Bartley, he said as he threw a leg over the horn of his saddle and loosened his reins. Red lowered his head and took a deep breath and sighed, which made both his nostrils flare and produce a snort. That's a good-looking animal you got there, Sheriff. Looks to be a young horse. Yes, sir. He's 4 years old and can jump a 4-railed fence. At least that's what his previous owner said. I'm inclined to believe him the way he carries himself. I put a few wet blankets on him before Hillsborough in here. Bartley put both hands to the tip of the broom and stood with one shoe over the other. Well, I do a little horse trading on the side. If you ever want to sell him, you be sure to give me first bid. Jubal patted Red on the neck and stepped down out of the saddle. With a large grin of satisfaction, he looked at the gelding from head to tail. That day, Mr. Bartley, will never come. You see, Red was a gift from 2 dear friends in Palestine. He reached and flipped the stirrup over the saddle and pulled the leather strap loose, holding the girth. No, sir. Me and this fellow are pards. Bartley smiled. Don't blame you. Don't blame you a bit. Say, he raised his hand and pointed up the street. Speaking of your horse. Jubal turned and looked up the boardwalk at the storekeeper. Albert at the library has a stall saved for your mount. All the hay and grain he can eat, compliments of the town of Glen Rose. Well, I'm much obliged for that, Mr. Bartley. That's mighty fine of you folks. Henry stepped to the edge of the boardwalk. Son, you'll need a good mount for this job. Jubal wasn't sure what Henry meant. He grinned and walked the gelding up the street to the jail. He wrapped his reins round the rail, pulled his rifle out of the boot, and walked inside. As he shut the door behind him, he leaned his Winchester against the wall, crossed his arms, and stared around the room at the furnishings. The first thing he saw was a huge oak desk next to the back wall with a big black chair behind it. Atop the desk was a bottle of rye and a shot glass. Jubal smiled. Although he wasn't fond of spirits, he appreciated the sentiment. He stepped over and sat down in the chair. Then he noticed a note beneath the bottle. He picked it up and held it to his face. Welcome to Glen Rose, Sheriff Stone. It was signed by the town council. Jubal uncorked the bottle and poured a finger. He held the shot glass in one hand and the note in the other. To Sheriff Jubal Stone, it said. Stone grinned, and as he put the glass to his lips, he felt the burning of the liquor going down his throat, reminding him of one of the reasons he abstained. Swallowing, he shook his head and slammed down the glass. Then he stuffed the cork back into the bottle and deposited it into the bottom drawer along with the glass. He clasped his hands behind his head and leaned back in the chair, taking it all in. For the next few months, Jubal Stone was euphoric. Less than 4 years ago, he was a nobody, living in obscurity. He lived among a family that didn't want him to be there any more than he did. Now, at 18 years old, he was wearing a sheriff's badge and had the respect of the whole town. Jubal popped out of the chair and walked over to the 2 Winchesters and greener double-barreled shotgun chained to the gun rack. These would be his tools for keeping law and order in Glen Rose, along with a Colt on his side. There were 2 boxes of cartridges for the rifle and 1 box of double-aught buckshot on a small shelf underneath the guns for the shotgun. The first thing Jubal thought about was whether or not the weapons were loaded, but a small lock attached to the chain kept him from pulling them off the rack. Stone walked back over to the desk and found several keys in the top drawer. One of them looked small enough to fit the locks in the guns, so he gave it a try. He was sure that the other keys were to the cells. Sure enough, the small key was the right one. As he inserted it, the lock popped open. He pulled at the chain running through the trigger sections and gripped the first Winchester. Slowly, he pushed down on the lever and saw brass. Smiling, he placed the rifle back in its place and grabbed the second one. It, too, was loaded. Next, he gripped the greener and checked the chambers. Frowning, he cradled the shotgun in the bed of his arm while he opened the shell box with his other. As he loaded the buckshot into the chambers, his mind quickly traveled back to Palestine. He recalled the night that Sheriff Peel came calling on Black Jack Tanner and his boys in the saloon with an empty scattergun. Oh, Monty, he thought, I won't ever do that. There was a knock on the door. Jubal pushed the shotgun back into the rack and turned toward the door. Come on in, it's unlocked. The door swung open and in came the mayor, a smiling Jack Livingston. His daughter, a frail, thin-looking young lady, shadowed him. Hello, Sheriff Stone. Turning to the young lady, he said, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Shelley. Ma'am, Jubal tipped his hat. How are you today? Timid and shy, Shelley nervously looked to the floor and slowly disappeared behind her pa's back. She looked to be in her early 20s, so he wondered why she was behaving like a child. Jubal searched Jack's eyes for an explanation, but he only smiled and turned toward the desk by the wall. Later, Jubal would learn that Livingston's daughter was born prematurely and had lots of complications, surviving the early years of her life. I see you found the rye. Yes, I did, Mayor Livingston. That was mighty nice of the town council. Well, we won't keep you, Sheriff. Shelley and I just wanted to say hello. As they were leaving, someone else was coming through the door. It was council member and tax assessor Fred Dearman, along with his wife. Hello, Mayor and Miss Shelley, Dearman said as he quickly stepped to the side of the doorway and tipped his hat. Good day to you, Fred and Mrs. Dearman. Has our new sheriff arrived? Asked Fred as he pulled off his hat. He sure has. Shelley and I were just saying hello. Jack put his arm to the back of his daughter and gently pushed her forward down the boardwalk. Jubal came to the door and welcomed his newest visitors inside. Throughout the day, Jubal had a steady flow of townspeople in and out of his office, welcoming him to Glen Rose. He appreciated their friendliness, and in between visits, he unpacked his gear. It finally seemed as though things have settled down until Jubal heard a knock at the door. Got your mail, Sheriff. The older fellow was dressed like a clerk and wore black from his wrist up to his elbows. Jubal plopped a sack of wanted posters down on the small table and threw his leg over one of the stools. Flipping them from one pile to another, he kept his eyes peeled for any man that favored Tobias Fletcher. It had been over 4 years since Stone had seen the man who ambushed his pa, and it was only a side view that he got that day. Yet Fletcher's profile was etched in his memory like the face of his own mother. Then suddenly, Jubal straightened as he peered down at the paper in his hands. A familiar face jumped from the poster, but it wasn't Fletcher's. There in black and white was 3 Silver Creek banditos, and a $1,000 reward centered above their heads. Upon their attempted ambush of him a few days ago, Jubal had only gotten a short glimpse of 2 of them, before they disappeared into the brush as he held their leader Juan at gunpoint. Stone smiled as he gripped the paper. Well, if it isn't my friend Juan, reckon I let $1,000 slip through my hands. According to Texas law, now that Stone was on the job as Glen Rose's sheriff, he was not eligible to collect bounties. Wagging his head, he stood up and walked over to the wall where he tacked the wanted poster to the board that bore several others. As he stood there studying the collage of faces, none bore Fletcher's image. 2 weeks later, Jubal was at a few doors down from the jail, checking his mail. He heard someone running up the boardwalk yelling, "Sheriff! Sheriff!" It was a 10-year-old Johnny Crawford, a sandy, blonde-haired boy who worked for Daniel Crenshaw in his dry goods store. He was running full chisel toward Stone. Crawford lived with his elderly grandfather. His mom and pa both died of cholera when he was only 3. Jubal put out his arms and stopped him. He was breathing heavy. "What's wrong, Johnny?" "Hurry, Sheriff!" He threw his thumb over his shoulder. "There's 2 fellas down at Mr. Crenshaw's mercantile, trying to sell him some guns, watch his boots and stuff." He took a couple of breaths and swallowed largely. "Mr. Daniel told me to fetch you. Figures what they're selling is stolen goods." Jubal adjusted his gun belt and straightened his hat. "You ever see these men in town before?" "No, Sheriff, but lots of Mexicans pass through Glen Rose." "Mexicans?" Jubal waved his hand. "Follow me, Johnny." They hurried off to the jail. Jubal opened the door and stepped quickly to the board that held over a dozen wanted posters. He pointed to the Silver Creek banditos. "Any of these fellers look familiar?" Johnny's mouth flung open and he gasped. He put his finger to the poster. "Those two yonder, that's them, Sheriff Stone." "You sure, Johnny?" Johnny pulled his hat from his head. His face exuded with confidence. "Right, sure." Jubal stepped over to the gun rack and unchained the greener. "Let's go." When they stepped out on the stoop, Johnny said in a high pitch, "There they are!" Jubal quickly put his hand to the boy's shoulder. "Settle down, Johnny. Don't want to spook him." From the direction they were headed, he figured he'd catch up with them in the Thirsty Horse Saloon. Sure enough, the two men seemed thirsty because they pushed right through the double doors and disappeared. "You stay here, Johnny." Stone briskly moved down the boardwalk with his shotgun in the bend of his arm. When he reached the saloon stoop, he looked down at the hitch. There he saw a familiar-looking filly. It was Juan's gaunt, underfed mount that he'd seen over 2 weeks ago standing off in the brush. It was the same horse the bandit wanted to trade for Stone's roan. This was another confirmation that indeed the Silver Creek Banditos were in town. Just before Jubal stepped through the double-swinging doors, he checked the barrel for a load. Seeing the buckshot, he snapped the barrel shut, pulled down his hat, and lowered the gun beside his leg. He planned to take the Mexicans by surprise, and hopefully without gunplay. However, his cover was quickly blown by one of the residents of Glen Rose, so he suspected. "Howdy, Sheriff. You hunting bear today?" Jubal acknowledged with a frown. "Charlie." The Mexicans were too engrossed in getting on the other side of the bottle in front of them to notice Jubal's entrance and hear Charlie's salutation, so it seemed. Jubal glanced their way and quickly recognized Juan, who looked directly at him. The saloon was filled with patrons, so Stone decided to exit and brace the banditos elsewhere. He stepped out on the stoop and down the streets where he untied Juan's filly and led her into the middle of the street. Dropping her reins, he hurried into a nearby alley and waited. 10 minutes later, Juan and his partners came wobbling out of the saloon door. From their demeanor, it was obvious they killed the bottle. Juan stared down at the hitch, his head moving back and forth, as he struggled to focus on the spot he last tied his horse. However, the sorrel was not there. He yelled something derogatory in Spanish, as evidenced by the angry expression on his face. Then one of his partners chuckled and pointed a crooked finger. Juan staggered out into the street, waving his hands in frustration. His partners in crime followed, heckling him all the way. That's when Jubal made his move. With his shotgun waist high and both hammers drawn back, he stepped out of the alley. "Howdy, amigos." The men stopped immediately, and they started for their guns. Jubal fired a barrel of buckshot into the ground a few feet from them. All three men threw up their hands and begged for mercy. "Skin them guns, boys, and chew dirt." The three men got sober quickly and did exactly as Jubal said. Juan was the last one to belly down on the ground, and he did so with a thud. Stone looked toward the jail where a wide-eyed Johnny stood. Jubal waved him over and handed him his pistol. "Well, Mr. Johnny Crawford, congratulations on bringing the Silver Creek Banditos to heel. Figured you got $1,000 coming to you." Juan stared up from the ground incredulously and shook his head. Johnny pointed his pistol his way. The bandit slowly turned his face down to his elbow and groaned. He knew his days of freedom were over. Jubal glanced over at Johnny and saw the excitement on the boy's face. He winked. "Let's get these fellas to jail, Mr. Crawford. Then we'll go have us a cold sarsaparilla. How's that sound?" "Fine as rain, Sheriff." That day, Johnny Crawford officially became one of Stone's honorary deputies. Jubal gave him a badge, and Mayor Livingston wrote him a commendation in the town square. 2 weeks later, a $1,000 check arrived at the Stone's office. It was written out to Johnny Crawford as a reward for apprehending the Silver Creek Banditos. This money would go a long way in securing a future for the boy, since his grandfather was no longer around to take care of him. For the next 4 years, Stone served the people of Glen Rose faithfully and fairly. Like his pa, people came to know him as a man who always gave a square shake. Townspeople loved him because he kept them safe, but it was more than that. Jubal Stone seemed to genuinely care about people, especially those who were elderly and vulnerable. If anyone were to tempt fate and get on his bad side quickly, all they had to do was mistreat one of them, and the fury of Jubal Stone would burn hot. Stone's reputation was quickly spilling over into neighboring towns and across much of Texas. Consequently, he was contacted frequently by officials from other towns twice the size of Glen Rose, trying to persuade him to come and be their sheriff. Even among his fellow lawmen, he was highly respected and often consulted, even though most of them were 10 years his elder. Jubal's anvil fists, his fast draw, and his unquestionable moxie was just what the Texas frontier needed. Chapter 9. Jubal delivers his man. Frank Benson, a United States Marshal out of Waco, wired Jubal requesting his assistance in extraditing a prisoner from Bono, Texas to Fort Worth. The Marshal had his hands full at the moment keeping the peace in his town as drovers poured in from the annual cattle drive, and he couldn't leave. Jubal was glad to help, even though the prisoner he'd be escorting was known as a cold-blooded murderer. Early that morning, before Stone pulled out for Bono, he lit the pot-bellied stove in the jail and cooked up some coffee. As he warmed his hands to the flames, he studied the wanted posters of the man he'd be escorting, Cable Lane. As Jubal studied the image, he felt a chill go up his spine. Something about Lane put him on edge. This was nothing new for Stone. He had a knack for spotting killers, and he knew he was looking at one. Jubal pulled his pistol and stuck the barrel to the poster. "You give me trouble, Lane, and I'll put a dirt blanket over you." Stone drank down his coffee and grabbed up his gatherings, his rifle and saddlebags, and headed for the depot for his ticket. He arrived in Bono that evening and stopped in at the jail before checking into a hotel. Jubal visited with Sheriff William Bly for about 15 minutes and told him he planned to leave at daybreak with the prisoner. Bly, a seasoned lawman, wasted no words warning Stone about the prisoner. "Jubal, that's one of the meanest sons of Cain I've come across. He bit me when I pushed his tray through the bars and snarled tooth and fang like a wolf. When I told him what I'd do with him the next time he tried that, he backed away from the bars and laughed like a crazy man." With a crooked smile, he pushed out his suspenders and leaned in. "Gave Bob Dawkins a black eye and busted nose." "Sheriff Dawkins of Stephenville?" "Yes, sir." William smiled and bumped Jubal with his elbow. "Dawkins got in a few licks himself. That's why Lane's missing a couple of teeth." A look of consternation came over Jubal's face. He knew what a game Lawman Dawkins was. "Well, let's take a look at this animal." Bly reached for his keys and for the big stick leaning against the wall. As the two of them stepped in front of the Lane cell, they both stood at the ready. But the moment was anticlimactic. Cable Lane was lying on his bunk snoring. Jubal whispered, "Reckon even demons sleep sometimes." As a lawman turned to exit, Lane came alive. Somehow he got to his feet and his hands through the bars before Jubal could respond. Lane grabbed Stone by the coat and pulled him hard against the iron. His strength was more like that of two men than one. With his face inches from Jubal's, he told him his plans. "Gonna kill you, law dog, and cut out your gizzard." Bly cursed Lane and came down hard on his knuckles with the hickory stick. Lane quickly released Stone as he stumbled backwards, laughing wildly. Jubal straightened his coat, then he and Lane exchanged vicious stares. What Stone was seeing in that cell only confirmed what he had suspected earlier that morning as he studied Lane's wanted poster. He was a devil for sure, a man who had no conscience, and a rabid animal that needed to be put down. "Taking you to Fort Worth, mister. Pig or pork." "See you in the morning, Sheriff." Jubal tipped his head and walked out. Bly nodded and stood there until he heard the outside door shut. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigar. With 2 fingers, he jammed it into his mouth and began to chew on it as he stared at Lane. "What are you looking at, law dog?" Lane asked. With lightning speed, he responded, "Well, you can usually find out yonder by the hitching post." He threw a thumb towards the door. Lane rushed forward and grabbed the bars, but Bly didn't flinch. "That fella will never get me to Waco. I take an oath on it." With a wrinkled jaw, Sheriff Bly slowly reached and took his cigar from his lips and wiped his mouth. "Jubal Stone will fetch you to Waco. I'd bet my 10 star on it." Bly chuckled and patted his badge as he reinserted his stogie. As he walked toward the door, he turned on his heels. "Now, whether you're breathing or draped over leather sleeping when you get there, that there will have to be determined." Early the next morning, Stone and Bly escorted their prisoner down the boardwalk into the train station without incident. Jubal wondered why Lane was being so docile and cooperative, but did not take his eyes off him. He knew he was more dangerous than a rail car full of longhorn bulls. "All aboard!" yelled the ticket master. Jubal gestured for Cable to board. That's when the party started. Lane stepped up the iron steps of the train and stumbled. When Jubal reached out to help him, he turned and went for Stone's pistol. Jubal latched onto his wrist and wrestled him to the ground. Bly assisted with a couple of kicks to the resistor's rib cage. Finally, the two lawmen restrained Cable and dragged him aboard the train. Several of the passengers gasped at the struggle between the two sheriffs and their prisoner. The aisle was too narrow for Bly and Jubal to travel together, so Jubal took the lead. He pushed Lane into a seat and quickly chained him to it. Bly stepped off the train as it began to move. Stone waved a hand through the window and sat down in the seat beside his prisoner. The train was bound for Cleburne and a short stop in Meriden. It couldn't get there fast enough for Sheriff Jubal Stone. A young woman kept looking over her shoulder at Jubal and Cable. The brunette looked to be in her 20s and traveling alone. With each stare, she seemed to become angrier. Finally, she arose from her seat and made her way down the aisle. Standing directly in front of Jubal, she spoke her mind.
"Sheriff, I must protest your brutality."
Jubal stood and removed his hat. "Ma'am, is there something I can do for you?"
"You and that other brute back there in Bono are treating this man like an animal."
Through her white lacy glove, she pointed at Lane. Lane played the lady like a straight flush. He reached to tip his hat, but his hand cuffed to the seat stopped him. She threw her hand to her mouth and gasped.
"You poor man! You poor, poor man!"
Jubal glanced at Lane, then back to the woman.
"Ma'am, my name is Denise Dupree. My father is a Louisiana senator."
The ticket master came down the aisle briskly, wondering what the matter was between Miss Dupree and the sheriff. Jubal tried to reason with her. "Ma'am, this man is a killer." He bent a thumb toward Cable. "You would be much safer if you returned to your seat." Dupree lowered her hands to her hips and raged.
"I plan to speak to my father about this. He knows many senators across Texas. I'll have your badge for this, Sheriff."
At that moment, Jubal would have been glad to hand it to her, but he had a job to do and a prisoner to deliver, and nothing was going to get in his way, not even women with political connections. "Is there a problem here?" came a voice over Denise's shoulder. It was a ticket master. His badge read Harold. "Please, escort Miss Dupree to her seat, Harold, now."
"I demand that you—"
Miss Dupree began. Harold put his hand on Dupree's shoulder. "Perhaps, miss, it would be best if you return to your seat."
"Well,"
said Denise as she pointed a finger at the ticket master,
"I plan to include you in my complaint as well."
Then she stomped up the aisle and plopped down in her seat. About an hour down the tracks, the train began to slow, then jerk to a stop. The cabin was abuzz with chatter. "Why are we stopping?" somebody asked. Jubal looked outside through the lower half pane of the window, but he didn't see a water tower. Out of instinct, he pulled his pistol and shoved it into Lane's side.
"Figure that's my boys." Cable yanked on the cuff. "Cut me loose, and when they board the train, I'll let you live."
Jubal heard voices and looked toward the door. Surprisingly, Stone told Lane he'd honor his prisoner's request, but it wasn't to spare his own life. He pulled the small key from his vest pocket and shook it in the air. "I'll unlock the cuffs, if you spare the passengers." Cable's eyes flashed back and forth from the cuffs to Stone.
"You got a deal, law dog."
Jubal kept his pistol pointed toward the killer as he leaned over and inserted the small key into the lock of the cuff clasped to the seat. As he reached to unlock the one around Lane's wrist, there was a distinct click. Jubal handcuffed himself to Jubal.
"Do you want to die on this train, lawman?"
Lane asked harshly. There was a scream of a woman from the connecting train.
"When my boys come through that door, your life won't be worth spit if you don't take this iron off me."
"I'll cut you loose after you tell your boys to spare the passengers. Else I'm gonna change your hat size." Jubal thumbed back the hammer on his Colt and put it to Cable's forehead. Lane thought for a minute and apparently decided he wanted to live another day. "Deal." Jubal lowered his pistol to his waist, but kept it pointed at his prisoner beneath the back of the seat. Two men crashed through the door with drawn guns, fanning them across the cabin looking for anyone who dare brace them. There were no takers. Then they spotted their leader. "Yonder he is in the back," said the broad-shouldered, slow-talking man with deep pockmarks in his face. "Cable," yelled the other man, donning double braids of hair and a medicine bag around his neck. He looked to be an Indian at first appearance, but his skin was lighter than most of the Indians Jubal had seen across Texas. Stone shoved his Colt in Elaine's belly. "Tell them not to kill any of the passengers." The two men were still at the front of the cabin figuring how they would free Cable from his captor. They knew by the badge affixed by Jubal's coat that he was a sheriff. The Indian jerked Miss Dupree from her seat and put a knife to her throat. "Let Cable go, or she will die." Dupree screamed and pulled at his hand until the Indian whispered something in her ear. Then she became calm. "Tell him, Lane, or I'll put a slug in your gut." "Let it go, Breed. The sheriff and I made a deal. Nobody gets killed." He turned to Jubal. "Throw your pistol out the window and hand me the key." Stone reluctantly did both. Cable stepped down around Jubal and into the aisle, looking toward the front of the cabin. He barked. "Fleece the sheep. Take all their valuables." Turning back to Stone, he smiled. "Now it's your turn to get chained to a seat. Let me hear the click of that cuff. Sheriff Jubal Stone." With a frown, Jubal took the loose cuff and attached it to the seat as he was told. Lane held up the key. "Reckon I'll take this with me." He deposited the key into his shirt pocket and patted his chest. Then he moved briskly up the aisle, sidestepping his men who were collecting the passengers' valuables. When Lane reached the front of the cabin, he looked down at Denise, who was bent over her seat, crying like a child. He pulled her up by the hair. "You're going with me, pretty woman." She screamed as Cable dragged her towards the door like she was a rag doll. Then he turned and looked past the passengers towards Jubal. "One more thing, Sheriff Jubal Stone," Lane chuckled loudly. "It was me that gave you that scar across your temple. And I believe it was my bullet that killed that little blonde-headed sister of your own. Just thought I'd give you something more to think about than getting loose from that seat." He turned to Denise. "Let's go, little missy. I figured using you as bait, we can get a passel of money from that Senator Pa of yours." Jubal jerked aggressively at the cuffs as he watched Cable, his men, and Denise disappear through the door. He'd never forget the horrified look on Miss Dupree's face. She was terrified. Blood dripped from his wrist, but he was still not free. Suddenly a burst of energy came over him. Cable's admission to killing his sister and shooting him in the head caused his fury to burn. Stone stood up and put his boot to the seat. With all his might, he yanked hard against the chain that connected the cuffs, ripping the iron seat from its purlins. The sleeve on his left arm was quickly turning crimson red from the cuff that had been cut into his arm. Then suddenly, a strange look came over him as he slowly set the seat back on the floor. He bent his head and reached for his hat. He flipped it over and reached inside the band. There he found it, a spare key to the cuffs. A lesson he'd learned from Monty Peel. Immediately, several gasps were heard from the passengers as they consoled one another. The ticketmaster rushed down the aisle to where Sheriff Stone was, freeing himself from his andirons. "Sheriff, what are you going to do about Miss Dupree? Now kill her for sure." Jubal pulled on his hat and looked out the window for his pistol. He pushed Harold out of the way. "Going to fetch my gun and get after them." "On foot, Sheriff?" asked a finely dressed fellow who lit up a cigar standing a few rows up from him. Jubal came up the aisle and stopped in front of him. "I reckon so, unless you have a horse tucked away in them fancy duds." Stone smiled and started forward. The man grabbed Jubal by the arm and whispered, "I happen to know where you can get one. I'm listening, Mr. Taggart's the name, Joe Taggart." Joe leaned forward and cupped his hands. "A few rail cars back, you'll find one of the finest stallions you'll ever lay your eyes on." Taggart leaned around Stone, making sure no one was listening. "He's a Tennessee walker. Belongs to that heavyset fellow lighting up that stogie and standing next to the door up yonder. His name's Davidson, Edward Davidson. I played a little poker with him earlier." "Obliged, Mr. Taggart. Perhaps he'll give me the loan of him." "Not hardly," Taggart chuckled. "He'd been bragging about freighting that stud to Missouri as a gift to the governor who has a horse ranch outside of St. Louis." "Is that a fact?" Jubal turned toward Davidson and thought for a moment. Then he rushed toward him. "Mr. Davidson, I'm Sheriff Jubal Stone. I understand you have a horse in this train. I'd appreciate the loan of him. If I could leave now—" "Absolutely not, Sheriff Stone." He tugged on his suspenders, smiled largely, and puffed several times on his cigar. "That black stallion is a gift to—" "The governor of Missouri. Yes, I've heard, Mr. Davidson. But you see, if I can get after Lane and his boys right now, I may have a chance to get that young lady back." The look on Davidson's face convinced Jubal that he was going to have to take horse by force, and as a lawman, he'd be within his rights to do so. Then he remembered something Denise said about her father. Mr. Davidson, I figure Senator Dupree of Louisiana would be mighty grateful to anyone who—
Senator Dupree,
said Davidson with an excitement in his voice. The girl's father, he's a Louisiana senator. The fat man rubbed his chin and called for Harold. Harold stepped forward, eager to help. Yes, Mr. Davidson.
Have my stallion unloaded.
Yes, sir. Harold started for the door.
And,
said Davidson as he pointed to the seat across from him,
use that saddle and bridle. Sheriff Stone will be riding the black.
Harold frowned as he turned to reach for the gear. He mumbled, oh, now they have me wrangling horses. Jubal stepped forward. I'll fetch the tack, Harold. You fetch the horse. He turned to Davidson. Obliged for the loan of the mount. I'll do my best to return him and the saddle in good shape. Davidson waved the hand, dismissing Stone's words, but quickly he revealed his motive.
Just remember to tell Senator Dupree about Edward Davidson, the owner of the black.
Jubal nodded, even though he was agitated by the man's words. A young lady had been abducted by a gang of ruthless killers, and all Davidson was concerned about was being rewarded. Then Stone remembered how he had baited Davidson by mentioning that Denise's father was a Louisiana senator. He tipped his hat. When Jubal stepped off the train, he heard Harold holler,
Bring the horse this way.
Then he saw the long-legged, solid black stallion. His neck was bowed as he danced from side to side, snorting. Stone walked toward the men and the horse, carrying the saddle with the bridle hanging on the horn in one hand and a blanket in the other.
There he is, Sheriff Stone,
said Harold. He turned to the man holding the rope. The horse was pawing the ground.
Hang on to him, Billy.
Jubal set the saddle and blanket on the ground and pulled the bridle from the horn. He patted the black on the shoulder and let him sniff the bridle. He suspected by the way he was behaving that the horse was greenbroke at best. Then he eased the bits between the studs' teeth and pulled the headstall over his ears. He noticed by the size of his teeth that he was young. Turning on his heels, he grabbed the saddle and blanket and once again let the stallion smell both. When he got the saddle atop his back, he tightened the cinch and backstrap and climbed aboard. The saddle wasn't broken in, and neither was the horse. The black reared and bucked several times, but quickly learned from Jubal Spurs who was in charge. Davidson stepped off the train and chuckled. Pulling a cigar from his mouth, he pointed.
Had a mustanger going to take the edges off him in St. Louis, but I reckon that's your lot now.
Stone pulled the horse in circles a couple of times and turned his head in the direction Lane and his boys rode and sunk his spurs into his belly. Let's see what you got, Midnight. The stallion threw his head and tail in the air and took off like a bullet in a strange gait, unlike anything Jubal had ever seen. A mile down the tracks, Stone saw where Cable and his gang left the railway and traveled down an embankment. The stallion balked at the steep grade at first, but again, Jubal's spurs motivated him to obey the rider. When they both got on level ground, Stone searched the ground from atop his saddle and saw some fresh horse manure and hoof prints. They were headed east, towards Hubbard. Jubal pushed the black hard for the next 2 hours. The horse had amazing stamina, but was plumb give out when they arrived in Hubbard. Stone didn't even have to ask if Lane and his bunch had passed through. A deputy wearing a frown and holding a shotgun met him at the outskirts of town.
What's your name, mister, and what's your business in Hubbard?
Jubal pulled back his coat. I'm Sheriff Jubal Stone of Glen Rose. I'm trailing Cable Lane and his wolf pack. You seen him, deputy?
Afraid I have. 3 of them, anyway. But I dang sure didn't know it was Cable Lane.
The young deputy pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead of sweat.
They robbed the mercantile store and shot Mr. Randall, the owner.
Jubal climbed down out of the saddle. From the sign I've been following, there's at least 5. What's your name, deputy?
Frank Todd.
Was there a young lady with them, Frank? Jubal pointed to his head. Long black hair, in her 20s?
No, 'twarn't no lady with him.
Todd pointed his hat at Jubal.
One of them fellers was an Indian. I glimpsed his long braids as he swung up on his horse and rode out of town. Fact is, I think I wounded him with my scattergun. The other 2, well, everything happened so fast I couldn't tell you much about them.
Jubal stepped toward the stallion and put his boot in the stirrup. Where's your sheriff?
At the other side of town. I figure he's nursing that shoulder he injured when they shot his horse out from under him. He was leading a posse after them fellers when somebody in the bushes ambushed him.
Frank reached down and picked up a rock from a small pile.
Here, you better take one of these.
He pitched it towards Jubal. The stallion flinched as he reached out and caught it. A rock? Jubal asked incredulously. What's this for?
It's to let the man on the first rooftop know you mean us no harm. Just hold it up as you ride into town.
Jubal chuckled. I figured my name being Stone would be enough. Todd mustered a faint grin. It was obvious he missed the humor in Jubal's remark. "All right, deputy, much obliged." Jubal nudged the stud and he took off in his gait. Frank cupped his hands.
"I ain't never seen a horse move like that. What kind is he?"
Jubal wheeled the black around with one rein. "Tennessee Walker." The deputy waved and turned back to watch the road. As Stone rode into town, the sound of the horse's hooves made a unique sound, unlike a quarter horse. Several people on the boardwalk stopped to take a look. Jubal tipped his head and held the white rock up for them to see that he was friendly. The man on the roof stood and pumped his rifle in the air in response.
"Where's the sheriff?"
Jubal asked as he looked up. The man bent his thumb to the right.
"Down yonder at the livery."
Stone stopped at the hitching post under the sign that read Brown Stables. Several men on horseback nearby eyed him as he climbed down. He quickly held up the white rock and pulled back his coat. "I'm Sheriff Jubal Stone of Glenrose. Here Cable Lane's gang paid you a visit."
"Cable Lane!"
one of them yelled loudly. He had his legs swung over the horn of his saddle and his arms crossed. He quickly sat up, grabbed his reins, and stuck his boots in his stirrups. His horse stepped forward, then took a couple of steps back. Sheriff Pitts came out of the livery at full chisel with his gun drawn and a snarl on his face.
"Where is he? Where is Cable Lane?"
The old crusty, big-bellied lawman pointed his pistol at Jubal and thumbed back the hammer. "No, Sheriff Pitts," one of the men said as he rode his horse between the two of them.
"This here is Sheriff Stone of Glenrose. He's trailing Cable and his boys. Sheriff Stone, this is our deputy, Dolby Pitts."
Pitts wagged his head, a little embarrassed that he'd pulled iron on a fellow lawman, and shoved his pistol back into leather and looked to the east end of town.
"So that was Lane's boys that hit us?"
"Yes, sir. I had Kane in custody until his gang stopped the train about 2 hours west of here."
"Dang shame you didn't pump a slug in his brain pan before he got away."
"I wanted to." Jubal lifted up on the brim of his hat out of frustration, but there were passengers to consider. His boys would have killed the passel of them just as sure as you're born. The breed already had a knife to the young lady's throat. Pitts stared down at Stone's blood-stained sleeve and gestured with his eyes.
"You hit?"
Jubal grinned. "Nah, just tangled with the train seat." The stallion whinnied several times and was quickly answered by his stable mare in season. Dewey Moss, the owner of the livery, came trotting out of the prod.
"I don't want no stallion around my place, mister. You ain't aboarding him here."
Dolby waved the hand.
"Now hold your fire, Dewey."
He pointed to Jubal.
"This here's Sheriff Jubal Stone out of Glenrose. He's after that bunch that just hit us."
Moss didn't seem impressed.
"Don't care if he's the president of the United States. I don't cotton to having a stud near my barn. Every mare on the place will be kicking up her heels and acting the fool."
He threw his hands up in the air. The men all laughed, including Jubal. "Mister, Dewey interrupted. With a stern face, he said,
"My name's Dewey Moss."
Jubal adjusted his hat. "Mr. Moss, I wasn't planning on staying. Fact is, this animal belongs to the governor of Missouri, or will when I finish with him."
"The governor, you say?"
asked Pitts. "Yes, sir. It's a long story, but right now I'm needing to get after Lane."
"I've got some unfinished business with that highbinder myself."
Pitts turned to the livery owner.
"Moss, fetch Sheriff Stone to fresh him out and bring me one too."
He looked at Jubal, then the black.
"We'll put that one in a halter and you can bring him along."
"Obliged, Sheriff." Stone unhitched the saddle and pulled it to the ground. One of Moss's stable boys brought out a halter and rope and handed it to Jubal.
"You fellows got our provisions?"
Pitts asked. "We do, Sheriff," they answered. 5 minutes later, Dewey led 2 geldings out of the hitch, both of them bays.
"I want my horses back alive."
Moss glared at Pitts and spat. A man in Pitts' posse jumped down and swung the sheriff's saddle atop the bay. Jubal wasted no time getting him on the other. When both sheriffs got aboard, Pitts winced in pain and yelled,
"Let's ride!"
In less than a minute, they rode upon the sheriff's dead horse. Already there were vultures lying low. A couple were sitting on limbs of the tree nearest the carcass. Pitts pulled up on his reins and stared down at the chestnut.
"You were a good old boy, Buck. 10 years of faithful service, and you never let me down."
Each man removed his hat out of respect for the sheriff's loss, including Jubal. A good horse on the frontier was invaluable and hard to replace. Pitts pulled his pistol and fired up into the tree. The wings of the 2 buzzards brushed the limbs as they took flight. With a frown, he watched the vultures as they joined the others above.
"Dang gut gnawers."
As hardcore as Pitts was, when he came to his horse, he was tender-hearted. For 2 hours, the posse of 6 followed hard after the outlaws. Cable and his gang continued to travel eastward towards Fairfield. As he reached a waterhole, Pitts eased down off his horse, slowly holding his shoulder. His face was pale. One of the men from town noticed. "Sheriff, you're white as a sheet. You can't ride in this condition."
"Dang if I can, McGuire. You watch me."
The man turned and walked back toward the others as they filled their canteens. Jubal studied the sheriff for a few minutes. He noticed that with every step he took, his face frowned in pain. He figured that maybe Pitts would take the advice of a fellow lawman better than from the posse and turn back, but he was wrong. "Sheriff Pitts, I ain't never seen a man with more grit than you, but you can't go on like this." Pitts waved his good arm, dismissing Stone's advice. Then suddenly, as if a bolt of lightning hit him, he went to his knees in writhing pain. Stone reached out to grab him. 2 of the men rushed over to assist. "He needs a doctor," said Jubal. "Make up a travois and get him back to Hubbard." The men wasted no time cutting saplings and rigging them together with ropes. Then they drew lots as to who would escort Pitts back home. It was Henry Carter, owner of the harness and saddle shop in town. Before Carter pulled away with Pitts, the sheriff apologized to the remaining posse.
"Sorry, fellers. I let you down, but you ride with Sheriff Stone as if he was me. I knew his paw. Dang good lawman. Didn't care for him personally, but if this is one half a cut of Joe, he'll go to hell and back to get his man."
Pitts couldn't have known how prophetic his words were at the time. To hell and back was exactly where Jubal was headed before his quest to recapture Cable Lane was over. Carter and Pitts struck west for Hubbard, while Jubal and the other 2 stayed on the fresh tracks leading east. 3 hours later, and about 10 miles out of Fairfield, they crested a hill. Shots rang out from several directions. McGuire barreled off his horse and rolled to cover behind a tree. Jubal pulled his rifle and jumped into some brush, but the other man traveling with them wasn't so lucky. Harry Blakely, McGuire's brother-in-law, took a slug to the chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. Stone made eye contact with McGuire, who was about 20 yards from him behind a tree. The man was in shock as he stared at his kin lying face up on his back. Jubal whispered to him, but that still did not garner his attention. Then he remembered the rock he'd put in his shirt pocket. Fishing it out, he tossed it McGuire's way. That got his attention. McGuire's eyes flashed with fear as he fanned his pistol in several directions. Jubal whispered again, "Are you hit?" "No, but Henry's dead." He buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Jubal knew the pain of losing kin, but he also knew there was no time for McGuire to mourn Blakely's death. He got to his knees and stared into the direction the shot was fired. Then he heard a familiar voice.
"Sheriff Stone! Sheriff Jubal Stone!"
"I'm here, Lane. What do you want?"
"I want your blood, your life. You cheated me out of it once."
"You still hiding behind that woman, are you?"
"I done had my fun with her. Now it's the boys' turn."
Stone heard Dupree scream. Lane laughed loudly.
"We'll keep her alive. At least until her poppy pays up." "I'm gonna kill you, Cable, and your mongrels."
Just as Stone said these words, he heard a twig break off to his right. He raised his rifle. A couple of seconds later, the wounded Indian stepped out of cover, gripping his knife. The crack of Jubal's Winchester dropped him in his tracks.
"You're down a man, Lane." "You get the breed?"
"I did." McGuire was still reeling from Blakely's death and puzzled by the exchange between Stone and Lane. To him, Sheriff Jubal Stone seemed unfazed by Lane's threats, even after the Indian's attempt to kill him with a knife.
"We're going to ride on now, Stone, but don't get lost."
Then there was silence. Jubal looked to McGuire and waved to him to stay put. He rose up from the bushes and eased over to the Indian. With his rifle at the ready, he stared at the direction he'd last heard Cable's voice. Then he poked the breed with his gun barrel. His eyes were wide open, and his body bore several wounds. From the gaping hole in the buckskin covering his chest, Jubal knew where the slug from his Winchester had hit, but he wondered where the other dried blood had originated. He turned the Indian over, and his question was answered. He saw 3 small holes in the buckskin covering his back. It was lead from a scattergun. McGuire had hit the breed as he had earlier expected. Chapter 10. Bad News from Palestine. Jubal and McGuire wrapped Blakely's body in a blanket and laid it over the saddle of his horse. After they got it tied down, Jubal expressed his condolences. "I've lost kin before, McGuire. It hurts worse than a wolf bite.
I don't rightly know how I'm going to tell my sister that her husband's dead.
The good Lord will help you. If it weren't for him, I couldn't have suffered the loss of my family. Jubal spat. His emotions were raw as he gnawed on his lower lip. Fact is, Cable gave me this scar. He pointed to his temple. Killed my sister, too. With gritted teeth, he continued. Them mother demons traveling with him that day gunned down my pa and ma. McGuire could hardly believe what he was hearing. I don't know what to say, Sheriff. Jubal stuck out his hand. It's all right, pard. You take your brother-in-law home. I'll settle his account with Lane, and mine as well. By yourself, Sheriff? Stone raised his Winchester in the air and patted his Colt. Me and my cannons. Jubal grinned. He saw the consternation on McGuire's face. Friend, there's just some things a man can't ride around. For me, this is one of them. I'm on a hot trail, and I ain't leaving it. You take the pack horse. I've got enough provisions in my saddlebag to get me back to Hubbard. Oblige, McGuire. By the way, what's your first name? Bader. Jubal unhitched his saddle and put it on the black. Then he stuffed his rifle in the scabbard. He looped his rope over the stallion and pulled off the halter and handed it to McGuire. Slip that on the bay, Peter. I ain't going to need 'em no more. Sheriff, after I get Harry delivered home, I'll be back. Peter, I appreciate the moxie, but I don't want to give these killers any more targets than necessary. Go home. Your sister is going to need you. Peter climbed into the saddle. With sadness and much concern, he said goodbye and made his way toward Hubbard, leading the horse that was carrying his dead brother-in-law along with the bay. Suddenly, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. Good luck, Jubal. I don't know how you're going to do it. With a big smile, Stone mounted the black. Shoot, Peter. I'll have Cable Lane dallied around this new saddle horn before the end of the week. Then I'll play him a going-away tune on my flute. Jubal reached down in his coat and pulled out the wooden instrument. As he played the tune he planned for Lane, he and the black rode away. Sheriff Jubal Stone was under no illusions that Cable Lane would be an easy catch or kill. However, at this moment, nothing on God's green earth would keep him from his destiny. For the next 2 days, Jubal rode hard, day and night, stalking his prey like a cat. He was possessed by the hunt for Cable. With his Winchester draped over his saddle and his teeth on edge, he expected any time to see Lane or at least one of his men. He hoped he would because he was ready to pour hellfire into their hides with lead from his barrels. Jubal arrived in Fairfield uncontested. He quickly found the sheriff's office, introducing himself and asking if the sheriff had seen any strangers in town. The young lawman was cocky and brash and looked like to be in his mid-20s. He pulled his shirt close to his mouth and breathed on his badge. Then he wiped it clean with the bottom part of his shirt. I can't keep up with every drifter who comes to town. By the way, Stone, you're a little out of your jurisdiction, aren't you? His deputy, who was younger than him, laughed as he whittled on a stick until he saw the scowl on Stone's face. The men I'm trailing aren't drifters. They're killers, Sheriff. Killers. Is that a fact? He asked with a smirk as he rolled the smoke and lit it. Who are these killers you're talking about? Jubal was tempted to use his fist on the sheriff, but suddenly a feeling of dizziness overtook him. His eyes became blurry as he pulled the wanted poster from his pocket. I was on a Marshal's assignment to take Cable Lane to Waco. His gang stopped the train, and I had to cut him loose. Oh, I see. You let a killer go free. Is that what you're saying? Had to. The train was full of passengers. Cable's man had a knife to the throat of a young lady. Jubal was on the edge of boiling over. All he wanted to know was if the sheriff had seen Lane and his gang in town. You hear that, Earl? Stone here let a man with a knife talk him out of his gun. I heard him, Bob. With lightning speed, Jubal pulled his pistol and shoved it under the young fool's chin. I asked you if you'd seen any strangers in town. The deputy sat up and looked like he swallowed a frog. You stay put, Pop. Jubal snapped his fingers. Earl dropped his knife on the floor and stared like a man who'd seen a ghost. Strangers in town, Bob. Stone drew back the hammer on his pistol. The young sheriff wet his pants and frowned. Don't shoot me. Please don't shoot me. Jubal backhanded the tin horn, and he fell backwards across the big desk. Then he stepped over and grabbed his shirt with both hands and pulled them to his face. Strangers in town. Bob was so shaken that he couldn't speak. What about you, Deputy Earl? Anybody in town today that you've never seen before? Earl stood up and moved a little farther from Stone, afraid he'd do the same thing to him as he did Bob.
There was a couple of fellers and a gal I'd never seen.
What did she look like? Blonde hair, tall, heavy-set?
No, sir. This lady was black-headed, thin, medium height.
He held his hand up to his nose.
She was a nervous type.
You dang fools. Jubal peered at Earl, then to Bob with ultimate disgust. One of the most notorious killers on the frontier just rode through your town. You two idiots need to shuck them badges and find a different line of work. Neither of the men said a word as they nervously watched. Stone walked toward the door. Suddenly, Jubal had another spell of dizziness. He leaned against the door and grabbed his forehead. You got a doc in town? He looked over his shoulder and snarled. A doctor in town, do you have one?
Yes, sir,
answered Earl as he stood up straight. Go get him. Stone pulled the door open and staggered out. I'll wait out here on the stoop. Earl looked back at Bob, who was still wiping his pants from his accident. Then he followed Jubal outside and went for the dock. In about 10 minutes, the town sawbones showed up with a small black bag and tended Stone. He felt his forehead and quickly stuck a thermometer in his mouth. A couple of minutes later, he pulled it out and held it to his spectacles. The glass read 103 degrees.
Sir, you need to be in bed, resting.
Jubal began to shake with chills. He pulled his coat up tight around his body and quivered. His eyes looked weak and dim. With a weak voice, he answered, What is it, Doc? Apparently, Earl had told the doctor on his way over that Jubal Stone was a sheriff. Sheriff, you have a serious case of influenza. We've got to get that fever down. Let's get you to your feet and to my office. I have an extra room where you can spend the night. Earl, get over to Mr. Steggle's ice house and bring back a small sack of ice.
Doc, I'm a deputy, not a wet nurse.
Jubal turned and looked his way. Although he was very sick, from the look he gave Earl, the deputy was certain he could still do him harm.
I'll head over now. How much did you say you needed?
A flour sack full will be sufficient. Earl nodded. Jubal slowly lifted his head. Obliged, deputy. Earl grinned.
Yes, sir.
Take it slow, Sheriff. My office is up the street here. By the way, I'm Dr. Sparks.
Jubal Stone, Doc.
I appreciate your... Jubal's legs buckled, and he almost went to his knees. Sparks grabbed his arm. Take your time, Mr. Stone. As you see, I'm not big enough to tow you. They both chuckled and continued towards Sparks' office. That night, Jubal's fever spiked to 105. Dr. Sparks stayed up with him, constantly applying a rag packed with ice to his forehead. Stone was out of his head and hallucinating. Several times through the night, he yelled and reached for his gun on his side, thinking it was there, but it was not.
Let her go, Cable. Let her go,
he screamed. Fortunately, the doc had directed him to hang his gun, along with his knife, on a peg when he first entered the office. Jubal tossed and turned, fought and kicked, and fell off the bed twice. Sparks attempted to calm him, but his brain was under the influence of a life-threatening fever. However, the next morning when he awoke, he felt much better. He rose out of bed quickly and carefully in order to not wake Sparks, who was fast asleep in the chair next to him. He picked up his boots and tiptoed toward the door, and led into the office, and he eased it open. He reached into his pocket and pulled out several bills and laid them on the doctor's desk. Then he buckled on his gun belt, seated his hat on his head, and left. He briskly moved down the boardwalk past the sheriff's office and peeked through the window as he went by. He saw Earl, waved, and kept going. Earl jumped up from his seat and poked his head out the door. As sick as Stone was last night, he couldn't believe how fast he was moving. Shaking his head, he looked up the street in the direction the doc's office was located. He turned back toward Jubal and thought, that fellow's hard as a rock. No wonder his name is Stone. Jubal paid the liveryman for stalling and feeding the black. Then he led the saddled stallion and pack horse over to the telegraph office. He wanted to send Sheriff Monty Peel a telegram. From the trail he was following, it looked as if Lane and his gang were headed straight to Palestine. He described Cable and communicated to Peel that he had kidnapped the black-headed woman. As the telegrapher read his message, his eyes darted back and forth from the paper to Stone. Something wrong, mister? Jubal asked. His mouth flung open as he looked to his right and then to his left. As he leaned across the counter, he waved Jubal closer. I ain't supposed to do this, Sheriff, but given you're a lawman and given the message you're about to send, something's burning in my craw. Well, spit it out, friend. I need to get a wiggle on. He pursed his lips, looked to his right and left side, then said, That Cable fellow sent a telegram to a Senator Dupree yesterday. He's asking for a ransom for the man's daughter. He told me he'd cut my fingers off if I, told. Glad you did. If that man sends that money, he'll never see Denise again. Not sure she's above snakes. You know the woman Lane is holding? I do. Where did Cable tell the senator to send the ransom? To Palestine. Jubal slapped the desk. "Send my telegram now, and include the information you just told me." The clerk turned quickly to his desk. "Yes, sir, I'll get it off right away." Jubal stepped out on the stoop and quickly realized that the extra horse at the hitch would most likely slow him down, so he made his way to the livery. The liveryman came out of the barn. "Got a loose shoe?" "No, sir." Jubal climbed down and began untying the tarp over his provision. He pulled out a bag of flour, some jerky, and some coffee. Then he stuffed them into his saddlebags. "I'm leaving the sorrel with you. He belongs to some fellow in Hubbard. If I'm not back in a week, see that he's returned, would you?" Jubal pulled out his wad of cash and paid the man $10. "If that doesn't cover it, talk to Peter McGuire. He'll see to the balance." Just as he was leaving the livery, Doc called to Stone. "Sheriff Stone," he said, huffing and puffing with agitation. "You are a sick man. I advise you get back to bed immediately." "Doc, I appreciate your concern, and fact is, I wouldn't mind sleeping a couple of days, but there's a killer at large. He's holding a young lady for ransom. I know where he's going, and I plan to meet him there." "Sheriff Stone, you don't seem to understand the severity of influenza. You could die." "Denise Dupree could die also. My ma and pa and my sister were done in at the hands of this killer." Jubal pointed angrily at his scar. "Cable Lane put this here, and I intend on putting him in the ground." "Ah, Cable Lane. You spoke of him last night when your fever went to 105, along with a Tobias Fletcher." "Yeah, Fletcher's the next one on my list, right behind Lane." Jubal climbed up in the saddle and felt a hint of dizziness, but he kept that dry. "Thanks again, Doc. I won't forget what you did for me." Sparks wagged his head in disgust and mumbled, "Dang fool." He tossed Stone a bottle of pills. "You're going to need those." Then he turned on his heels and walked slowly back towards his office. Faintly he mumbled, "You're the one that will be put in the ground." Jubal smiled and turned toward the liveryman. "I pity the man who puts him on the prod. Sounds to me like you already have." He led the pack horse into the barn. Stone hurried outside and mounted the black before lighting a shot for Palestine. He was roughly 35 miles from his destination. He hoped to get there in a day and a half. The first couple of hours in the saddle, Jubal did fine. However, the dizziness returned along with severe headaches. Even with the black's smooth gait, Stone's head felt like it was going to explode. He could feel his shirt becoming soaked with sweat. Pulling his coat up tight, he rode on, shivering as his teeth chattered together. Several times he even bit his tongue, causing a bitter taste in his mouth from the blood. Late into the night, Jubal finally stopped. He was now in familiar territory about 5 miles from Palestine. He slid down off the stallion and tied him to an overhanging limb. His vision was blurry as he searched the saddlebags for the pills the doc had given him. Finally, he found them and swallowed 2. Then he pulled his bedroll from the saddle and spread it on the ground. He barely had the strength to unsaddle the black, but he did it anyway. Then he collapsed across his bedroll and slept hard through the night. He woke the next morning to a heavy mist falling on his face. As he rose and wiped his face, he saw the black still tethered to the limb and smiled. "Well, howdy, Midnight. How about some grain?" He stood up and almost fell back down, wobbling around the campsite. "Reckon the doc was right. This influenza's got me by the chin hairs." Jubal bent down with his hands to his knees and took several deep breaths. He shook his head in an attempt to clear his vision, but that didn't help. In fact, it made things worse. Now, instead of seeing one black stallion, he was seeing 2. He milled around in his saddlebags and found a small sack of grain. Crawling over to Midnight, he poured it on the ground in front of him. Then he used the big trunk of the cottonwood to stand up. Loosening the rope around the stud's neck, he let him feed while he sat down with his back against the tree. The chills continued to buffet his body, but Jubal Stone had a job to do, and even if it took his life, he was determined to do it. Stone reached over and rubbed the muzzle of the black. "You like that grain, don't you, boy?" Several times since the day Jubal first climbed aboard the stud, he wished for his roan. Today, he was happy to be riding the stallion. "We've got to get to Palestine, Midnight. We ain't fur." Jubal blinked his eyes several times, slowly recognizing the stand of cottonwood surrounding him. "This is the grove, they call it. Well, I figure it, we're about 5 miles from trouble." Jubal wrestled the saddle up from the ground along with the blanket and put them both on the horse. As he got them centered over the stallion's back, he wiped his forehead of sweat and leaned against the horse to get his wind. Midnight bent his long neck around and sniffed Jubal. A few days ago, that would have been considered an aggressive act by the stallion. But today, Stone knew the horse meant him no harm. Stone stroked Midnight from his forehead down to his muzzle. "Good boy." Then he reached under his belly and pulled the cinch tight and buckled the backstrap. The horse threw his head in the air. Stone noticed that Midnight never seemed to like the tightening of the cinch. Jubal pulled on his bridle and untied the rope around the stallion's neck. "Let's get to Palestine, Midnight." As he rode out of the grove and onto the main road, he gave the black a loose rein. Once again, the horse found his stride and clipped off the next 3 miles with little effort, as Tennessee walkers were known to do. Jubal was still feeling weak, but managed to stay square in the saddle as he cradled his Winchester. The closer he got to Palestine, the more alert he came, despite the ill effects of his sickness. Now, only a half-mile west of town, he heard riders. He pulled off the main road, and he and his mount disappeared into a thick stand of mesquite. Reaching for his binoculars, he glanced up ahead. It was one of Lane's men, the heavier-set fellow who came into the train cabin a few days ago and fleeced the passengers. Denise Dupree was traveling alongside him. She wasn't enjoying it a bit. As they rode closer, Jubal could hear the vile-talking man speaking of his plans for young Dupree. She begged him not to harm her, but he just laughed and ordered her toward the mesquite. Jubal glanced the road behind them and saw no one. He thought this might be a trap set by Cable, but as far as he could see, the big man and Denise were traveling alone. He eased down off Midnight and tied him to a log. Then he pulled his Winchester and snaked his way toward the two.
"All right, little lady, that's fair enough. Get down and let you and me get better acquainted. Find out old Dick will be as gentle as you are to him."
Jubal raised up on his knee and leaned his rifle against a leaning tree. He drew a bead on Deke and started to pull the trigger, though. His head began to swirl. Then he heard Dupree scream. He blinked several times as he stared down his steel sights. Finally, the image of Deke was clear as he reached and ripped Denise's dress. When she resisted his advances, he raised a hand. That's when Jubal's Winchester barked. Denise screamed as he fell forward against her, grabbing her arms, refusing to let go. Stone stepped out from the tree and pumped another slug into the brute's side. Immediately, he released his grip on Dupree and fell face down on the ground. Denise turned toward Jubal and threw her hand to her mouth, surprised and relieved by his presence. He waved her toward him, and they both hid behind the tree for a couple of minutes before speaking. As he held her hand and kept her pulled close to the tree, he could feel her pulse beating fast. The young lady had been through the mill, but to Jubal she seemed to be holding her own. "Where is Cable?" Denise fell into Jubal's chest and wept. He patted her on the back, but then quickly pushed her away. "Where is Cable, Miss Dupree?" Still sobbing and sniffling, she pointed back towards Palestine.
"He killed the sheriff and is now waiting for the money to arrive by train from my father."
"Lane killed Monty Peel?"
"Yes, him and that one." She pointed to the dead man. "Ambushed him as Lane called him out on the street. It was horrible."
"What about Cable's other 2 men?"
"The sheriff killed one of them an hour before Lane arrived. The other, I don't know."
Jubal let go of her and sunk down to the ground on his haunches in total disbelief. Monty Peel? Dead? Sheriff Monty Peel? Then he rose back up, shifting his weight to his knees and looked at Denise. "Are you sure it was a sheriff and not somebody else?"
I'm sure,
Denise said with regret.
Cable Lane even took his badge and is wearing it."
Immediately upon hearing those words, Jubal got to his feet and started intently towards Palestine. It was as if Dupree's revelation had cured him of his illness. "I'll fetch your horse." She grabbed him by the arm and he started forward.
"We're not going back to Palestine, are we?"
"Yes, ma'am, we are. I've got 2 funerals to attend."
"But what if..."
"What if Lane kills me?" He pointed to his temple. "Well, he's tried that once and failed. Now it's my turn. I'll fetch you up a horse." Denise nodded with concern and watched Jubal walk toward the horses. She looked down at her torn, tattered dress and thought about the last few days. Suddenly, she felt embarrassed, trying to imagine what the young lawman who had just rescued her must be thinking. As the 2 of them rode toward Palestine, they didn't say much until they reached the edge of town. "Denise, I want you to climb down and find your way to Rosie's diner. Tell her Jubal Stone sent you. She'll be upset with Monty's death, so maybe you can give her some comfort."
"Okay, Sheriff Stone. I believe I saw her in town earlier. She's the one who ran to the sheriff's body."
Jubal swallowed hard, trying to choke down the thoughts of losing his friend. Then he remembered something Monty Peel had told him. "Don't let your emotions get you killed." "Call me Jubal, ma'am." Denise smiled warmly and dropped the reins as she climbed down out of the saddle. Then she looked up at Stone.
"You'll be careful."
"Jubal." He tipped his hat. "Always. Now where'd you say Lane was waiting?"
"At a saloon across from the train depot," she pointed. He said my father sent the money he requested.
How much was it, if you don't mind me asking?
$20,000.
Jubal stared down at Denise from the black with a crooked smile. I would have asked for 10 times that amount.
Denise smiled, but then quickly looked down at her dress and thought about the last week of her life. I don't think so, Jubal. What those men did to me has mocked me for life. I believe those here in the West would call me a soiled dove, a painted lady. No man would ever look upon me favorably.
Jubal glanced toward town, feeling the urge to get moving, but then looked back at the sobbing young lady. He jumped down out of his saddle and pulled Denise off in the alley. Well, I'm a man, and I think you're one of the prettiest ladies I've ever laid my eyes on. He took her by the hand and kissed it. Nobody back yonder in Louisiana needs to know what happened to you in Texas. Denise stroked Stones' face.
Thank you, Jubal, but I'm afraid this kind of thing can't be kept a secret. It's part of who I am now. Reckon I'll be known as a woman Cable Lane took.
Not to me, you won't. I see a sassy brunette from Louisiana who has her whole life ahead of her. But speaking of Cable Lane, I reckon I better get up the street here and say my howdies.
About 10 minutes later, Jubal Stone met up with the killer. Cable stepped out on the stoop of the saloon. The first thing Jubal noticed was the badge he was wearing. It was Sheriff Monty Peel's badge. You're under arrest, Lane. Shuck that shooter and throw up your hands. Cable had a beer in his hands and a grin on his face. He raised the brew as a toast to Jubal.
Congratulations, Chasson. You made it to the party after all. Too bad you missed the young lady. She and Deke were having a little get-together outside of town.
I don't think so, Lane. Not unless Deke has been resurrected. Cable gulped down his beer and threw the empty mug against the wall, shattering it into many shards.
So, he killed the girl and you killed him?
Jubal shook his head. Nah. Miss Dupree rode back into town with me.
You're a liar, law dog. But whether she's alive or not, in a couple of minutes you'll be dead, and I'll be rich.
Cable stepped forward.
And if she is back in town, I believe I'll just pay her another visit.
He chuckled loudly as he widened his stance. Stone lowered his hand to his gun. Cable did the same. Suddenly, a blast from a shotgun echoed down Main Street, and a man fell from the saloon rooftop to the ground between them. It was the last of Cable's men.
Well, Sheriff Monty Peel, you don't kill so easily. Reckon when I finish with Stone here, me and you will dance again.
Jubal wanted to look around to confirm the good news that Monty was alive, but he knew not to trust the man standing in front of him. Peel cleared his throat.
That's a deal, Lane, and you'll have to get by Jubal Stone first. I figure in a couple of minutes they'll be placing dimes over your eyes. How you gonna kill him, Jubal? With your guns or fists?
Cable chuckled.
You remember when I took hold of you in jail the night we first met, Stone? You'd be wise to stick with your pistol. Otherwise, I'm liable to beat you to death with my bare knuckles.
He pumped his fists in the air.
At least with a gun, you'll die quickly, and this time you will die.
Jubal's fury burned. Standing before him was a man who had taken so much that was precious and dear to so many, especially him. Images of his slain family flashed across his mind, along with the troubling reality that Lane and his men had stolen the innocence of Denise Dupree, and no telling how many other women and girls across the frontier. Fist or iron? Makes no difference to me, Lane. There was a train whistle off in the distance.
Ah, my money is arriving,
said Lane as he looked toward the depot. He slowly reached and unbuckled his gun and raised his fists.
Nobody's ever beat Cable Lane with their knuckles, and it ain't starting today, not from a scar-faced kid.
Peel, wounded and leaning against a crutch as he held his shotgun waist high, stared at Jubal's back, waiting for his response. He's seen others poke fun at Stone's scar and lived to regret it. Cable's words ironically breathed life into Jubal. In the last couple of days, his body had been under a vicious assault by influenza. The previous night, he could hardly stand, much less walk. Today, he was bracing a man 2 inches taller and notorious as one of the meanest and strongest men to plague the West. Most men would do all they could to avoid him, but not Jubal Stone. As he stepped Jubal's way, he did so with an evil smirk. Stone unbuckled his gun and pitched it behind him. Monty limped off to the side with his greener still in his grip. He didn't trust Cable for a second and would gladly empty both barrels into his sorry carcass.
Come on, Scarface. You just gonna stand there and quiver in your boots?
Lane taunted Stone over and over as he punched the air and stepped closer. dashing from left to right as if he were in a boxing ring. Some who were there that day said that Jubal Stone suddenly turned into an animal after Lane landed his first punch. He moved like a cat, buffeting both sides of the bigger man's body with powerful punches. Cable connected with several good ones himself, but none seemed to faze Jubal. Stone's chin was as hard as steel. 8 years had passed since this young man saw his family gunned down, and one of the men who did the killing was standing in front of him. Jubal breathed hard and lit in the lance again, but this time it was like a whirlwind, bringing blood from his opponent's lips, nose, and forehead. Stone's face didn't look so well either. One of his eyes was quickly swelling shut. However, Jubal Stone had a debt to settle, and as long as Cable was on his feet, he figured to pay him in full with his anvil fists, inherited from his pa. Lane was no pushover, but he knew he couldn't sustain many more licks from Stone without losing consciousness. So, he swung wildly in 3 vain attempts to take off Jubal's head, but the lawman weaved and ducked and threw vicious counterpunches of his own. Finally, the Titan fell hard to the ground. Jubal jumped on him like a duck on a June bug, slamming his head against the ground and pummeling his face with hammer fists.
"Reckon you ought to stop him, Sheriff?" asked one of the bystanders. "He'll kill that man for sure."
Puddles of blood formed on the ground, commingling with the dirt.
"Stop in my eye. I'll shoot the man who tries. And as for killing that killer, I hope he does. He's not fit to wear skin."
Peel spat and wiped his chin. A few more blows to Lance's face and he went limp. Jubal reared back one more time to hit him, but stopped. He looked up at Peel, out of breath with a very bloody face.
"I got him, Monty. I got the man who killed my sister."
With those words, he collapsed, despite his futile attempts to stay up. Then he heard a soft voice whisper in his ear, "Give me your hand, Jubal." It was Denise Dupree. Monty barked,
"Help the little lady, boys. Get him up to docks."
3 days later, Jubal Stone awoke from a deep sleep. He saw the image of someone sitting in a chair next to him. The morning sun formed a halo around whoever it was. He rubbed his eyes and blinked several times. Is it an angel? He wondered. Rubbing his eyes again, he saw one of the prettiest ladies he'd ever seen. Denise Dupree leaned forward, smiled, and touched his hand. "Welcome back, Jubal. You had us worried." She kissed him on the forehead. Then he heard a man behind her clear his throat. It was Denise's father.
"Sheriff Stone, my name is Robert Dupree, Denise's father. I'm a United States Senator from Louisiana. I am eternally grateful to you for saving my daughter." He put his hand to Denise's shoulder. "I will never be able to pay you back for your courageous acts. I have a report from the ticket master of how you spared the passengers on the train by freeing the now deceased Cable Lane. Furthermore, I am aware, sir, that you tracked this vicious gang even while you were in the clutches of influenza. In the words of Sheriff Monty Peel, Jubal Stone would follow a blood trail to hell if need be. Your bravery and lawman skills have not gone unnoticed."
He cleared his throat again and brushed the paper in his grip.
"I have in my hands, sir, a document from President Chester Arthur. He gave me his permission to swear you in as a United States Marshal. That is, of course, when you're able to get on your feet again."
He pointed to the bed. Jubal sat up straight in the bed and swallowed hard, putting a thumb to his chest, and asked, "Me? A United States Marshal?"
"You dang right, Jubal,"
said a loud voice coming from the doorway. It was Monty Peel. The next day, the folks of Palestine gathered in the town square and took part in commissioning Jubal Stone as the United States Marshal. Stone was emotional as Senator Dupree removed his sheriff's badge and replaced it with the United States Marshal's badge. However, the surprises weren't over. Not by a long shot. Edward Davidson came walking through the crowd, leading the black. When he reached the front, he handed the reins up to Jubal.
"Here in the saddle belongs to you now, Marshal."
Stone stepped down off the podium and rubbed Midnight's muzzle. "I don't know what to say." "Thank you, Mr. Davidson." The fat man drew out 3 cigars from his vest and stuffed them in Jubal's front pocket. Leaning forward, he whispered,
"The senator from Louisiana is a generous man."
His eyebrows went up and down as he fished for a cigar for himself. Jubal grinned and shook his head. Denise joined Stone as they stroked the black. The crowd erupted in applause. Monty then stepped up on the platform and waved the townspeople quiet.
People.
Everyone stopped clapping and turned their attention to Sheriff Peel.
"There's one more wrinkle to this here occasion."
He peered down at Jubal.
"Marshal Stone, would you step back up here?"
Jubal looked at Denise and whispered, "Now I wonder what that wily fox is up to now." Denise smiled and gave him a gentle shove. "Go ahead, Jubal."
He closed one eye and cocked his head sideways. I figure you're in on this as well. Stone smiled, stepped up, and joined Monty at the podium. Peel removed his hat.
Jubal, I told you several years back that you would one day be the cut of your paw, Joe Stone. Well, the sun has come up on that day.
Monty quickly pulled out his red bandana from his back pocket and wiped the tears from his eyes.
Your pa would be mighty proud of you, son. But since he's not here to tell you that, I will.
Monty leaned over and gave Jubal a bear hug. Even though he was still in much pain over his gunshot wounds, Jubal reciprocated. Then he felt a tug on his waist. When he looked down, a man was buckling on a gun belt around him. It was Herschel Nelson, the sheriff of Abilene, Joe Stone's former deputy. Nelson stepped back and put out his hand. That there's your pa's gun belt and his .44 Colt. I've been saving it for you, Jubal, for the right time. And I figured that's now. Stone could hardly contain himself. He shook Nelson's hand, looked down, and dropped his hand to the pistol, rubbing the handle and running his hand over the dark brown, worn gun belt. Memories of his paw buckling on the same gun flooded his mind. Monty swallowed hard and broke the silence.
Well, let's see you jerk iron, son.
Jubal reached for the Colt. It leapt out of the leather like a rattler's strike. The crowd gasped at the speed of the young United States Marshal, Marshal Jubal Stone. Up until this day, he had been carrying a .38. Now, he was toting a .44. Peel straightened and pushed out his chest like a peacock as he stepped to the podium again.
Folks, that yonder is Jubal Stone. His pa was Joe Stone. Both of them sons of Texas and two of the finest lawmen to ever wear a badge and tote a gun.
The people stepped forward and congratulated the newly commissioned marshal with pats on the shoulders and handshakes. Jubal Stone's new assignment would be in Waco and would begin in 2 weeks. That would give him enough time to check on the sheriff and Hubbard and his friend Peter McGuire. First, however, there was a pretty young brunette boarding a train with her pa back to her home state of Louisiana that garnered his attention. I'll never forget you, Jubal Stone, Denise said as she stood on the first step of the train and faced him. Her pa was standing behind her.
With your permission, sir,
Jubal said as he removed his hat and ran his hands through his hair.
Permission granted, Marshal Stone.
Jubal leaned in and kissed Denise on the cheek. With both hands, she cupped her hands around his chin and pulled them close as she gently kissed his lips.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jubal Stone. I'll never forget you. The train began to move, and Jubal stepped back and tipped his hat.
You're a fine woman, Miss Dupree.
Denise smiled and waved at him with her lace-covered hand. As the train moved down the tracks, picking up speed, Jubal smelled the sweet fragrance of Denise's lingering perfume on his cheeks. Then he felt the hand on his shoulder.
How about a belly full of biscuits and bacon, all you can eat?
No, sir, Stone answered with a grin as he turned to Peel.
Figure I'll have your usual.
The two stove-up lawmen slowly made their way to Rosie's diner. The next day, Jubal loaded up the black and caught the train west to Hubbard. While there, he visited with Peter McGuire and asked him for a favor. Anything, Jubal, I'd be proud to help. I'm giving the black to Sheriff Pitts to replace his chestnut, but first I want him gelded. Stone reached down inside his coat pocket and pulled out $5 and handed it to Peter. I know just the man to take care of that. I'll take him over there now, Jubal.
Obliged, Peter.
How's your sister?
Better middling.
She's a stronger woman than I thought she was. Jubal rubbed his chin and looked back toward the train depot, thinking of Denise.
Yeah, them women folk will fool you sometimes, won't they?
Peter nodded and began to untie the stud.
Oh, the saddle goes with.
Stone turned toward Midnight. Well, boy, this is where our trail ends. Take care of the sheriff. The horse nickered and nudged him with his nose as if he understood. After Jubal stopped in on the sheriff, he checked into a hotel and got a good night's sleep. Early the next morning, he caught the train to Hillsboro where he resigned as sheriff and thanked the town people for their support. Leading his saddled roan out of the livery, he and Red boarded the westbound train to Abilene. He had one more stop to make before assuming his role as a marshal of Waco. He wanted to visit the grave of his ma, pa, and sister, something he'd hankered to do for the last 7 years. It was a sobering moment as he bent down and talked to each of them as if they were present. Then he slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his piccolo. As his fingers danced upon the holes in the wooden instrument and his breath traveled through the hollow tube, a beautiful tune floated across the Texas wind. It was the tune he'd heard Frank play the night he met him on the train, the same night Frank had died and left Jubal the gift of the flute. This concludes Jubal Stone, U.S. Marshal, Blood Trail to Hell by Casey Nash. Copyright by Casey Nash and published by Dusty Saddle Publishing,
a division of DS Productions.
We hope you have enjoyed this story. You can find this and many more books by Casey Nash on Amazon, available on Kindle and in paperback. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stagecoach, brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, the home of Western excellence where the best of the Western authors can be found. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue to bring you stories of the Old West.